Sarah Martinez had always been the quiet one in her family. At 23, she worked as a night shift nurse at St. Mary's Hospital in Chicago, caring for patients while the rest of the world slept. Her colleagues knew her as reliable, gentle, and someone who never complained about the long hours or difficult cases. What they didn't know was that Sarah had been living with a secret that was slowly eating away at her spirit. For the past 2 years, Sarah had been in a relationship with Marcus, a man who seemed charming to everyone else but showed a different face behind closed doors. He controlled every aspect of her life, from what she wore to whom she could speak with. Her friends had started to drift away, not because they didn't care, but because Marcus had cleverly isolated her from everyone who might notice the changes in her behavior. The winter of 2019 was particularly harsh in Chicago. Snow piled high on the streets, and the bitter wind cut through even the thickest coats. Sarah's apartment building was old, and the heating system barely worked. She often found herself wearing multiple layers just to stay warm inside her own home. Marcus had moved in 6 months earlier, claiming it would help with expenses, but really it gave him more control over her daily life. On the night that would change everything, Sarah was coming home from a double shift at the hospital. She was exhausted, her feet aching from standing for 16 hours straight. All she wanted was to take a hot shower and sleep. But as she climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment, she could hear Marcus shouting at someone on the phone. His voice was angry, violent even, and she recognized the tone that usually meant trouble for her. Sarah quietly inserted her key into the lock, hoping to slip inside unnoticed. But the old door creaked, and Marcus immediately ended his call. He turned toward her with eyes that burned with rage. Sarah had seen that look before, and she knew what was coming. Her heart began to race as she tried to think of something to say that might calm him down. Marcus accused her of being late, of not answering his texts fast enough, of looking at other men at work. None of it was true, but Sarah had learned that defending herself only made things worse. She stood there, still in her scrubs and winter coat, as he yelled at her about imaginary infractions. The neighbors had complained before about the noise, but nothing ever came of it. As Marcus's anger escalated, he began throwing things around the small apartment. A coffee mug shattered against the wall near Sarah's head. She flinched but didn't move from her spot near the door. Years of this treatment had taught her to become very still when he was like this, hoping his rage would burn itself out without turning physical. But tonight was different. Marcus had been drinking, and the phone call had put him in a mood darker than usual. He grabbed Sarah by the shoulders and shook her hard, demanding to know where she had really been and who she had been with. His grip was tight enough to leave bruises, and Sarah could smell the alcohol on his breath as he screamed inches from her face. The apartment felt like it was closing in around them. The broken heating system meant the temperature inside wasn't much warmer than the freezing weather outside. Sarah's breath was visible in small puffs as she tried to remain calm and not provoke him further. She had learned that fighting back only made the violence worse, so she had developed a strategy of becoming almost invisible during these episodes. Marcus suddenly released her and stormed into the bedroom, slamming the door behind him. Sarah stood in the living room, shaking from both cold and fear. She looked around at the mess he had made and wondered, not for the first time, how her life had become this nightmare. She thought about her mother, who lived 3 states away and had no idea what was happening. She thought about her sister, who had tried to warn her about Marcus early in their relationship. The silence from the bedroom was almost worse than the yelling. Sarah knew from experience that Marcus was probably planning his next move, deciding how to punish her for whatever imaginary crime he had convinced himself she had committed. She moved quietly to the kitchen and began cleaning up the broken mug, careful not to make any noise that might set him off again. As she swept up the pieces, Sarah caught sight of herself in the reflection of the dark window. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Her face was pale and thin, her eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. She had lost weight over the past months, partly from stress and partly because Marcus controlled what food came into the apartment. The heating system coughed and wheezed, then fell silent completely. The apartment began to grow even colder. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, still wearing her coat because she was afraid to make any movement that might disturb Marcus. She sat down carefully on the edge of the couch, trying to think of a way to fix the heater without making noise. Outside, the wind howled through the streets, rattling the old windows of the building. Snow continued to fall, and Sarah could see, her breath becoming more visible as the temperature dropped. She realized that if the heat didn't come back on soon, the apartment would become dangerously cold, but she was too frightened to do anything about it while Marcus was in his current state. Hours passed. Sarah remained on the couch, growing colder and more exhausted. She could hear Marcus moving around in the bedroom, occasionally talking to himself in angry mutters. The broken mug wasn't the only thing that needed cleaning up, but she didn't dare move around too much. The apartment grew so cold that frost began forming on the inside of the windows. As dawn approached, Sarah realized she had been sitting in the same position for over 6 hours. Her body was stiff and numb from the cold. She was still wearing her work clothes from the hospital, and she hadn't eaten anything since lunch the previous day. The combination of fear, exhaustion, and cold was beginning to make her feel disoriented. This was the moment when Sarah's life hung in the balance, though she didn't know it yet. The decisions made in the next few hours would determine whether she would continue to live as a victim or find the strength to reclaim her life. The freezing apartment had become a prison, but sometimes it takes reaching the absolute bottom before finding the courage to climb back up. By morning, the apartment had become an icebox. Sarah's lips had turned blue, and she could no longer feel her fingers or toes. She had been sitting motionless on the couch for nearly 8 hours, too afraid to move and risk waking Marcus. The frost on the windows had grown thicker, and her breath came out in thick clouds that seemed to hang in the air. Marcus finally emerged from the bedroom around 7 in the morning. He looked at Sarah with disgust, as if her condition was somehow her fault. He complained about the cold and demanded that she fix the heater immediately. When Sarah tried to explain that she had been afraid to make noise, he became angry again. He told her she was useless and stupid, then grabbed his jacket and left for work without another word. Alone in the freezing apartment, Sarah finally allowed herself to move. But when she tried to stand up, her legs wouldn't support her weight. She had been sitting in the cold for so long that her muscles had stiffened and her circulation was poor. She fell back onto the couch, panic beginning to set in as she realized how dangerous her situation had become. Sarah managed to crawl to the thermostat and discovered that the heating system had completely broken down during the night. The temperature inside the apartment was only a few degrees warmer than outside, where it was well below freezing. She tried calling the building superintendent, but no one answered. It was too early in the morning and she would have to wait hours for help. Her cell phone battery was nearly dead and the charger was in the bedroom. Sarah didn't want to go in there because it felt like Marcus's territory, a place where bad things happened. But she needed to call in sick to work and try to reach someone who could help her. She crawled to the bedroom and plugged in her phone, then quickly retreated to the living room. As the phone charged, Sarah assessed her situation. She had no heat, very little food, and no one she could call for immediate help. Marcus had systematically cut her off from friends and family members who might have come to her aid. Her bank account was nearly empty because Marcus controlled their finances. She felt completely trapped and more alone than she had ever been in her life. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was a trained nurse who helped people in medical emergencies every day, yet she couldn't seem to help herself. At the hospital, she was confident and capable. She made life-saving decisions and comforted patients through their worst moments. But in her personal life, she had become a shadow of herself, unable to take even basic steps to ensure her own safety. When her phone finally had enough charge, Sarah called the hospital to report that she was sick. Her supervisor was concerned because Sarah never missed work, and she asked if everything was okay. For a moment, Sarah considered telling the truth. She imagined explaining about Marcus, about the broken heater, about spending the night frozen in fear. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she said she had caught a cold and would hopefully be back the next day. After hanging up, Sarah sat in the cold apartment and cried for the first time in months. She had been holding back tears for so long, afraid that showing emotion would give Marcus another reason to hurt her. But alone in the freezing silence, she finally let herself feel the full weight of her despair. She cried for the person she used to be, for the dreams she had given up, for the life that seemed impossible to reclaim. The crying actually helped warm her up a little. and it cleared her mind enough to think more rationally about her situation. She needed to get warm, she needed food, and she needed to figure out what to do about the heater. More importantly, she needed to start thinking about what to do about Marcus. The events of the previous night had shown her that the situation was escalating, and she might not survive if things continued on their current path. Sarah managed to find some candles and a lighter, which provided a small amount of heat and light. She wrapped herself in every blanket she could find and huddled near the candles, careful not to create a fire hazard. The tiny flames reminded her of camping trips she had taken as a child with her family, back when she felt safe and loved and protected. As the day wore on, Sarah began to feel a strange sense of clarity that she hadn't experienced in years. Maybe it was the cold clearing her head, or maybe it was the fact that she had reached such a low point that she had nowhere to go but up. She started to remember who she had been before Marcus, and she began to wonder if that person was still somewhere inside her. She thought about her work at the hospital and how much it meant to her. She loved helping people, and she was good at it. Her patients trusted her, and her colleagues respected her skills. She had worked hard to become a nurse, and she had been proud of her career before Marcus began undermining her confidence in everything. Sarah also thought about her family and the friends she had lost touch with over the past 2 years. She wondered if they would welcome her back if she found the courage to reach out. She had been so ashamed of her situation that she had pushed everyone away, but maybe it wasn't too late to rebuild those relationships. As afternoon turned to evening, Marcus returned from work in a foul mood. He was angry about the cold apartment and blamed Sarah for not getting it fixed. He seemed to have forgotten that he had forbidden her to make noise that morning, and that she had no money to pay for repairs even if she could find someone to do them. The argument that followed was worse than usual. Marcus accused Sarah of deliberately sabotaging the heater to spite him. He threw more things around the apartment and at one point grabbed her arm so hard that she was sure he had bruised the bone. Sarah retreated into herself, using the survival techniques she had developed over the past 2 years. But something was different this time. Instead of feeling completely helpless, a small spark of anger began to grow inside her. She was angry at Marcus for treating her this way, but she was also angry at herself for allowing it to continue for so long. The anger felt dangerous and exciting at the same time, like a flame that could either warm her or burn everything down. When Marcus finally stormed out again, claiming he was going to stay at a friend's place where it was warm, Sarah felt both relief and determination. She had survived another night, but more importantly, she had discovered that there was still fight left in her. The freezing apartment had become a crucible that was burning away her fear and revealing the strength that had been buried underneath. That night, as Sarah huddled under blankets and watched the candle flames dance in the darkness, she made a decision that would change the course of her life. She couldn't continue living this way. She deserved better, and somehow she was going to find the courage to claim it. The next morning brought no relief from the cold, but Sarah woke up with a determination she hadn't felt in years. She had spent the night making plans, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had some control over her situation. The first step was getting the heat fixed, not because Marcus demanded it, but because she deserved to be warm and safe in her own home. Sarah called the building superintendent again, and this time someone answered. The repair would cost $200, money she didn't have because Marcus controlled their bank account. But she remembered that she had a credit card he didn't know about, one she had kept hidden for emergencies. She had always told herself that someday she might need it, and that someday had finally arrived. When the repairman came to fix the heater, Sarah felt a small victory as warm air began flowing through the apartment again. It was such a simple thing, but it felt like the first step toward reclaiming her life. She took a hot shower, the first one she had enjoyed in days, and put on clean clothes. Looking in the mirror, she tried to see herself the way she used to be, confident and capable. While Marcus was at work, Sarah did something she hadn't done in months. She called her sister Elena, who lived in California. Elena had tried to maintain contact over the years, but Sarah had gradually stopped returning calls and messages because Marcus always made her feel guilty about talking to family. The phone rang several times and Sarah almost hung up, afraid of what Elena might say about her long silence. Elena answered on the 4th ring, and her voice was filled with surprise and joy when she heard Sarah's voice. They talked for over an hour, and Sarah carefully avoided mentioning Marcus or the details of her situation. But Elena was perceptive, and she could hear something different in her sister's voice. She asked pointed questions about Sarah's life and whether she was happy, questions that Sarah deflected but couldn't quite dismiss. After the call, Sarah felt both better and worse. Better because she had reconnected with someone who loved her unconditionally, but worse because the conversation reminded her of how much she had lost. Elena's life sounded full and exciting, while Sarah's had become small and fearful. The contrast was painful, but it also motivated her to think seriously about making changes. That evening, Marcus came home in a surprisingly good mood. The apartment was warm, and he seemed pleased that Sarah had taken care of the problem. For a moment, Sarah wondered if maybe things could get better between them. Maybe the crisis with the heater had been a wake-up call for both of them. She allowed herself to hope that this might be a turning point in their relationship, but her hope was short-lived. When Marcus discovered that Sarah had used a credit card to pay for the repairs, his mood changed instantly. He demanded to know where the card had come from and why she hadn't told him about it. Sarah tried to explain that she had forgotten about the card and only remembered it when she desperately needed it, but Marcus didn't believe her. The argument that followed was brutal. Marcus accused Sarah of lying to him and hiding money. He went through her purse and her belongings looking for other secrets. He found the phone number Elena had given her for a domestic violence hotline, something Elena had mentioned during their conversation. Marcus demanded to know what Sarah had told her sister and whether she had been talking about their relationship. Sarah tried to deny everything, but Marcus could see the guilt in her eyes. He grabbed her phone and scrolled through her recent calls, discovering not only the call to Elena, but also several calls she had made to research domestic violence resources. Sarah had been careful to delete the browser history, but she had forgotten about the call log. Marcus was angrier than Sarah had ever seen him. He threw her phone against the wall, smashing it completely. He told her that if she ever tried to leave him or talk to anyone about their relationship, he would make sure she regretted it. He described in detail what he would do to her, and his threats were specific enough that Sarah believed he meant every word. But instead of breaking her spirit completely, Marcus's threats had the opposite effect. Sarah realized that she was already living in hell, and his threats were just more of the same. She had been so afraid of making him angry that she had forgotten there were worse things than his anger. She was already losing herself piece by piece, so what did she really have left to lose? Over the next few days, Sarah began making secret preparations. She couldn't use her phone since Marcus had destroyed it, but she could use the computers at work. During her breaks, she researched domestic violence shelters and legal resources. She learned about protective orders and what evidence she would need to get one. She started documenting the abuse, writing down dates and details of incidents she had tried to forget. Sarah also began reaching out to old friends through social media, carefully reconnecting with people she had lost touch with. She was amazed by how many people welcomed her back warmly, asking where she had been and saying they had missed her. Some of her friends had suspected that something was wrong, but they hadn't known how to help when Sarah had pushed them away. One friend in particular, Jessica, had been Sarah's roommate in nursing school. Jessica lived on the other side of Chicago now, but she immediately offered to help when Sarah cautiously mentioned that she was going through a difficult time. Jessica didn't pry for details, but she made it clear that Sarah could call her anytime, day or night, if she needed anything. At work, Sarah's supervisor noticed that she seemed different. She was more focused and determined, but also more tense. Sarah had always been a good nurse, but now she threw herself into her work with an intensity that worried her colleagues. She volunteered for extra shifts and took on the most challenging cases, as if she was trying to prove something to herself. One night, while caring for a patient who had been severely beaten by her boyfriend, Sarah found herself crying in the supply closet. The woman's injuries were a stark reminder of where Sarah's own situation might lead. The patient had been unconscious when she arrived, and the doctors weren't sure if she would recover completely. Looking at her bruised and swollen face, Sarah saw a possible version of her own future. The patient's sister was staying at the hospital, and she told Sarah that there had been warning signs for years. The abuse had started small and gradually escalated until it became life-threatening. She begged Sarah to talk to her sister about leaving when she woke up, saying that this might be their last chance to save her life. As Sarah listened to the sister's story, She realized that she was looking at her own life from the outside. She was the patient in the bed, and Elena was the sister in the chair, waiting and hoping for her to wake up and save herself. The parallel was so clear that it took her breath away. She was running out of time to make a change before it was too late. That night, Sarah made a decision that terrified and excited her in equal measure. She was going to leave Marcus, and she was going to do it soon. She didn't have all the details worked out yet, but she knew that she couldn't wait any longer. Every day she stayed was another day closer to becoming the unconscious woman in the hospital bed. The only question now was how to do it safely. Marcus had made it clear that he wouldn't let her go easily, and Sarah knew that the most dangerous time for an abuse victim was when she tried to leave. She would need to be smart and careful, but most importantly, she would need to be brave. After 2 years of living in fear, it was time to find her courage. Sarah spent the next week carefully planning her escape. She had learned from her research that leaving an abusive relationship required strategy and preparation. She couldn't just walk out the door because Marcus would find her and drag her back, probably with worse consequences than before. She needed a plan that would get her to safety and keep her there. The first challenge was money. Marcus controlled their joint bank account, and Sarah's paychecks were deposited directly into it. She had the credit card she had used for the heater repair, but that wouldn't be enough to start a new life. She needed cash, and she needed it without Marcus noticing. Sarah began taking small amounts of money from the account whenever she went grocery shopping, claiming she needed cash for parking meters or vending machines at work. $5 here, $10 there, and gradually Sarah accumulated almost $300. She hid the money in a small envelope taped to the bottom of a drawer in the bathroom, somewhere Marcus would never think to look. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a bus ticket and a few nights in a cheap motel if necessary. At work, Sarah confided in Jessica during a phone call from the hospital break room. She told her everything, the whole terrible story that she had been too ashamed to share before. Jessica listened without judgment, asking practical questions about Sarah's plans and offering concrete help. She had a spare bedroom in her apartment and said Sarah could stay there as long as necessary. Jessica also connected Sarah with a friend who worked at a domestic violence shelter. The woman's name was Maria, and she had helped dozens of women escape abusive relationships. Maria explained the legal process for getting a protective order and helped Sarah document the abuse she had suffered. She also taught Sarah about safety planning and gave her a list of warning signs that might indicate Marcus was becoming suspicious. One thing Maria emphasized was the importance of having a go bag ready at all times. This would be a small suitcase or backpack containing essential items that Sarah could grab quickly if she needed to leave in a hurry. Sarah assembled her go bag carefully, including copies of important documents, a change of clothes, her nursing license, the hidden cash, and a few sentimental items from her childhood. Sarah hid the go bag in her car trunk, underneath the spare tire where Marcus would never find it. She also made copies of her apartment key and gave one to Jessica, in case she needed someone to retrieve her belongings later. Every detail mattered because she would only get one chance to escape safely. The hardest part was acting normal around Marcus while making these preparations. Sarah had to pretend that everything was fine, that she wasn't planning to leave him. She cooked his meals, did his laundry, and endured his criticism and control, just as she had for the past 2 years. But inside, she was counting down the days until she would be free. Marcus seemed to sense that something was different about Sarah, but he couldn't pinpoint what it was. She was more compliant than usual, agreeing with everything he said and avoiding any behavior that might trigger his anger. This should have made him happy, but instead it seemed to make him more suspicious. He began watching her more closely and asking detailed questions about her day at work. One evening, Marcus went through Sarah's purse while she was in the shower. He didn't find anything incriminating because Sarah had been careful to hide all evidence of her plans. But he did notice that she had less cash than he expected, and he questioned her about where the money had gone. Sarah had prepared for this moment and calmly explained that she had been buying coffee at work more often because the machine in the break room had better coffee than usual. The lie was believable enough that Marcus accepted it, but Sarah could see that he was becoming more paranoid. She realized that she needed to accelerate her timeline. She'd originally planned to wait another 2 weeks, but she could sense that Marcus was getting ready to do something drastic. His threats had become more frequent and more specific, and she had noticed him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. Sarah decided that she would leave on Thursday night. Marcus always went out drinking with his friends on Thursday nights and didn't come home until very late. This would give her several hours to pack her essential belongings and get to Jessica's apartment before he realized she was gone. She would leave a note explaining that she was ending the relationship, and then she would file for a protective order first thing Friday morning. The plan seemed solid, but Sarah was terrified. She had been with Marcus for 2 years, and despite everything he had done to her, leaving him felt like stepping off a cliff into the unknown. She would be starting her life over from scratch with no home, very little money, and the constant fear that he might find her. But she also knew that staying was even more dangerous than leaving. On Wednesday night, Sarah lay awake listening to Marcus breathing beside her and trying to memorize the feeling of safety that came from knowing exactly where he was. Tomorrow night she would be sleeping in an unfamiliar place, wondering if he was looking for her. The thought made her stomach clench with anxiety, but it also filled her with excitement. For the first time in years, she was about to do something just for herself. Thursday dragged by with agonizing slowness. Sarah went to work as usual, but she had trouble concentrating on her patients. She kept checking the clock and mentally rehearsing her escape plan. She had told her supervisor that she might need to take some personal time in the coming weeks due to a family emergency, planting the seeds for her eventual resignation if necessary. At lunch, Sarah called Jessica to confirm that everything was still on track. Jessica would be waiting at her apartment with hot soup and a bottle of wine to celebrate Sarah's freedom. She had also arranged for a friend who was a paralegal to help Sarah with the protective order paperwork the next morning. Everything was in place and Sarah just needed to find the courage to follow through. That evening, Marcus announced that he was going out with his friends as usual. Sarah prepared his dinner and watched him get ready, acting like it was just another ordinary Thursday night. When he kissed her goodbye, she had to force herself not to pull away. This would be the last time he would touch her. The last time she would have to pretend to be happy to see him. After Marcus left, Sarah waited 30 minutes to make sure he wasn't coming back for something he had forgotten. Then she began the process of reclaiming her life. She packed quickly and efficiently, taking only the things that were truly important to her. Most of her belongings would have to stay behind, but they were just objects. Her freedom was worth more than anything she owned. As Sarah carried her suitcase to the car, she felt like she was walking through a dream. The street looked different. The air smelled different. Even her own reflection in the car window looked different. She was no longer a victim hiding in the shadows. She was a woman taking control of her destiny, and that transformation was visible in every step she took. Sarah drove to Jessica's apartment with her hands shaking on the steering wheel. She was doing it. She was really doing it. After 2 years of fear and submission, she was finally choosing herself. The road ahead would be difficult, but it was her road to walk. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. Jessica was waiting at her apartment door when Sarah arrived, just as she had promised. The moment Sarah stepped inside, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she was carrying. Jessica's apartment was warm and bright, with colorful artwork on the walls and plants by the windows. It was everything that Sarah's life with Marcus wasn't. A place where she could breathe freely and speak without fear. They sat at Jessica's kitchen table drinking soup and wine, and for the first time in years, Sarah told her story completely. She talked about the early days with Marcus when he had seemed charming and protective, and how gradually that protection had become control. She described the isolation, the fear, the way she had lost pieces of herself until she barely recognized who she had become. Jessica listened without interrupting, occasionally reaching across the table to squeeze Sarah's hand when the memories became too painful. She didn't offer empty platitudes about everything being okay now, because they both knew that leaving Marcus was just the beginning. The real work of rebuilding her life was still ahead, and it would take time and courage that Sarah wasn't sure she possessed. Around midnight, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. He had discovered her note and was demanding that she come home immediately. The message was filled with threats and promises of what he would do if she didn't return within the hour. Sarah showed the phone to Jessica, and they both agreed that this proved she had made the right decision. The Marcus in the text message was the real Marcus, not the charming facade he showed to the outside world. More messages followed throughout the night, each one more desperate and angry than the last. Marcus called her repeatedly, leaving voicemails that ranged from pleading to threatening. He promised to change, then threatened to kill himself, then promised to kill her if she didn't come back. Sarah turned off her phone and tried to sleep, but the silence felt almost as threatening as the messages had been. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, matching Sarah's mood as she prepared to face the legal system. Jessica's friend Maria met them at the courthouse and helped Sarah navigate the process of filing for a protective order. The paperwork was extensive, requiring detailed descriptions of specific incidents of abuse. Sarah had to relive some of her worst memories in clinical detail, explaining dates and injuries and threats for a judge who might or might not believe her story. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, which meant Sarah would have to wait through the weekend, not knowing if she would get legal protection from Marcus. In the meantime, she had a temporary restraining order that was supposed to keep him away from her, Jessica's apartment, and the hospital where she worked. But Sarah knew that a piece of paper wouldn't stop Marcus if he was determined to find her. Over the weekend, Sarah tried to settle into her new temporary life. She helped Jessica with household chores, went grocery shopping, and attempted to establish some kind of normal routine. But every car that drove past the apartment building made her heart race, and every phone call made her jump. She was free from Marcus physically, but emotionally she was still trapped by the fear he had instilled in her. Jessica was patient and understanding, giving Sarah space when she needed it and company when she didn't want to be alone. They watched movies, cooked together, and talked about the future. Jessica helped Sarah research new apartments and encouraged her to think about what kind of life she wanted to build for herself. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to dream about possibilities instead of just surviving from day to day. On Sunday evening, Sarah made the difficult decision to call her sister Elena and tell her the truth about what had been happening. Elena was shocked and angry, but not at Sarah. She was angry at herself for not recognizing the signs and for not pressing harder when she sensed something was wrong. She offered to fly to Chicago immediately, but Sarah asked her to wait until after the court hearing on Tuesday. Elena's support meant everything to Sarah, but it also made her realize how much she had lost by isolating herself from people who loved her. She had pushed away friends and family to protect them from Marcus's anger, but in doing so, she had also deprived herself of the support system that could have helped her leave sooner. Monday morning brought a new challenge when Sarah had to return to work. She was nervous about leaving the safety of Jessica's apartment, worried that Marcus might be watching the hospital and waiting for her to appear. But she needed her job, both for the income and for the sense of purpose it gave her. Nursing was one of the few things in her life that Marcus hadn't been able to destroy, and she wasn't going to let him take that away from her now. Her supervisor and several colleagues noticed that something was different about Sarah, but she kept the details vague, saying only that she was going through a difficult personal situation. The hospital security team was informed about the restraining order, and they promised to keep an eye out for Marcus. Sarah felt somewhat safer knowing that there were people watching out for her, but she remained vigilant throughout her shift. During her lunch break, Sarah received a call from Maria with disturbing news. Marcus had been asking around about her, trying to find out where she was staying. He had contacted some of her former friends and even shown up at the apartment building, demanding that the superintendent let him in to collect his belongings. The police had been called, but Marcus had left before they arrived. This news confirmed Sarah's worst fears about how Marcus would react to her leaving. He wasn't going to accept her decision and move on with his life. He was going to make her pay for defying him, and the restraining order was just a piece of paper that might or might not protect her when he decided to act on his threats. Tuesday morning arrived with an ice storm that made the roads treacherous and the courthouse steps slippery. Sarah walked carefully into the building, flanked by Jessica and Maria, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. She had spent hours preparing for this moment, but she was still terrified that the judge wouldn't believe her, or would decide that Marcus's promises to change were more credible than her fears about future violence. The courtroom was small and sterile, with fluorescent lights that made everyone look pale and tired. Marcus was already there with his own lawyer, and seeing him again made Sarah's chest tighten with anxiety. He looked different somehow, more desperate and dangerous than she remembered. When their eyes met across the room, his expression was cold and calculating, as if he was already planning his next move. The hearing began with Sarah presenting her case, describing the pattern of abuse and explaining why she believed she was in danger. She spoke clearly and calmly, sticking to the facts and avoiding emotional appeals. Her evidence was compelling, with photographs of bruises, medical records from a hospital visit after a particularly violent incident, and documentation of Marcus's threatening text messages and voicemails. Marcus's lawyer argued that the relationship had simply ended badly and that his client posed no real threat to Sarah. He painted Marcus as a heartbroken man who had made some mistakes but was committed to moving on with his life. Marcus himself took the stand and delivered what seemed like a sincere apology, promising that he would respect Sarah's decision and leave her alone. But Sarah could see through the performance. She knew Marcus well enough to recognize when he was lying, and she could see the anger burning behind his eyes even as he spoke about respecting her wishes. The judge seemed to buy his act, asking pointed questions about whether Sarah might be exaggerating the danger she faced. For a terrifying moment, Sarah thought she might lose. The judge seemed skeptical of her claims, and Marcus's lawyer was skilled at making his client appear reasonable and remorseful. But then Maria presented additional evidence that Sarah hadn't known about. The police had been called to their apartment building multiple times over the past year, always for noise complaints that corresponded with the dates Sarah had documented as particularly violent incidents. The building superintendent also testified that he had been concerned about Sarah's safety and had considered calling social services on several occasions. His testimony was matter-of-fact and credible, coming from someone who had no reason to lie about what he had witnessed. After deliberating for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the judge granted Sarah a permanent protective order. Marcus was prohibited from contacting her, coming within 500 feet of her, or attempting to communicate with her through third parties. Violation of the order would result in immediate arrest and criminal charges. As they left the courthouse, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and fear. She had won an important victory, but she knew that Marcus wouldn't simply accept the judge's decision and disappear from her life. The real test would come in the days and weeks ahead, when she would have to rebuild her life while constantly looking over her shoulder. The protection order gave Sarah some legal recourse, but it couldn't protect her from the psychological damage that 2 years of abuse had inflicted. She found herself jumping at sudden noises, avoiding places where she might encounter Marcus, and constantly checking to mow. 6 months after leaving Marcus, Sarah was living in her own apartment for the first time in years. It was a small one-bedroom place on the north side of Chicago. Nothing fancy, but it was hers alone. She had painted the walls bright yellow, hung cheerful curtains, and filled it with plants that she tended carefully. Every morning she woke up knowing that no one would criticize her choices or demand to know where she was going. The transition hadn't been easy. For weeks after getting the protective order, Sarah had lived in constant fear that Marcus would violate it. He had tested the boundaries several times, driving past her workplace and sending messages through mutual acquaintances. Each incident had been reported to the police, and eventually Marcus realized that the consequences were real. He had been arrested once for violation of the protective order and spent 3 days in jail, which seemed to convince him that Sarah was serious about staying away. Sarah had started therapy with a counselor who specialized in domestic violence recovery. Dr. Williams helped her understand that healing from abuse was a process, not a destination. Some days were harder than others, and Sarah still struggled with anxiety and self-doubt. But gradually, she was learning to trust her own instincts again and to recognize that Marcus's treatment of her had been about his problems, not her worth as a person. At work, Sarah had become an unofficial advocate for patients who were experiencing domestic violence. She could recognize the signs that she had once missed or ignored in herself, and she knew how to approach victims with compassion rather than judgment. Her supervisor had noticed her special gift with these patients and had asked her to consider specializing in trauma nursing. The suggestion had excited Sarah because it aligned with her growing desire to turn her painful experience into something that could help others. She had started taking night classes toward her nurse practitioner degree, something she had dreamed about for years but had never pursued while she was with Marcus. The coursework was challenging, but she found that she had a hunger for learning that had been suppressed for too long. Elena had visited several times, and their relationship had grown stronger than it had ever been. Having someone who knew the whole truth about what she had endured was both comforting and empowering. Elena never treated Sarah like a victim or made her feel fragile. Instead, she celebrated every small victory and reminded Sarah of her strength when self-doubt crept in. Jessica remained Sarah's closest friend in Chicago, and their bond had deepened through the crisis they had weathered together. They had weekly dinners and movie nights, simple pleasures that Sarah had forgotten she enjoyed. Jessica was dating someone new, a kind man who treated her with respect and affection. Watching their healthy relationship helped Sarah understand what normal looked like, and gave her hope that she might find love again someday. But Sarah wasn't ready for romance yet. She was still learning how to be alone without being lonely, how to make decisions based on her own desires rather than fear of someone else's reaction. She had gone on a few casual dates, but she found herself hyper-alert to any signs of controlling behavior. Her therapist assured her that this vigilance was normal and would fade with time. But Sarah wasn't in any hurry to let down her guard completely. One unexpected development was Sarah's relationship with photography. She had always enjoyed taking pictures, but Marcus had mocked her hobby and discouraged her from pursuing it. Now she carried a camera everywhere and found herself documenting the beauty in everyday moments. She had even entered a few of her photos in local competitions and had won second place in a contest sponsored by the Chicago Tribune. The camera had become a tool for reclaiming her perspective on the world. Through the lens, Sarah saw colors more vividly and noticed details that had escaped her attention during the years when she was focused solely on survival. Photography taught her to be present in the moment, rather than constantly anticipating the next crisis or explosion of anger. Sarah had also reconnected with her faith, something that had been important to her before Marcus, but had gradually faded during their relationship. She started attending a small church near her apartment, drawn initially by their community service programs, but staying for the sense of peace she found there. The pastor, a woman named Reverend Martinez, had become a mentor and friend, offering spiritual guidance without judgment about Sarah's past. Through the church, Sarah had started volunteering at a domestic violence shelter, the same one where Maria worked. She helped with intake interviews and provided emotional support to women who were just beginning their own journeys to freedom. It was difficult work that sometimes triggered her own memories, but it was also deeply fulfilling. She could offer hope to women who couldn't yet imagine life beyond their current circumstances. One evening, while Sarah was working late at the shelter, a young woman named Carmen was brought in by police. She was bruised and frightened, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and a small bag containing a few essentials. Sarah recognized the look in Carmen's eyes, the mixture of fear and shame and desperate hope that maybe this time would be different. Sarah sat with Carmen through her intake process, helping her navigate the paperwork and explaining what resources were available. Carmen reminded Sarah so much of herself 6 months earlier that it was almost painful to watch. But Sarah was able to offer something that no one else could give: the knowledge that survival was possible, that life could get better, and that the fear would eventually fade. As Carmen settled into her room at the shelter, she asked Sarah how long it would take before she stopped being afraid. Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. She told Carmen that the fear might never disappear completely, but it would change. Instead of the paralyzing terror that currently consumed her, it would become a useful awareness that helped her make better choices about the people she allowed into her life. Sarah realized as she spoke that she was describing her own journey. The terrified woman who had once frozen in a cold apartment rather than risk Marcus's anger had become someone who could face her fears and choose courage over safety. She still had moments of anxiety and self-doubt, but she also had something she had never possessed with Marcus: the knowledge that she could survive anything life threw at her. That night, as Sarah drove home from the shelter, she reflected on how much her life had changed. She was no longer the woman who had believed she deserved Marcus's treatment, or who had been too afraid to imagine a different future. She was building something new and beautiful from the ashes of her old life, and every day brought new possibilities. The protective order was still in effect, and would be for another 1.5 years. Sarah hoped she would never need to use it, but she was grateful for the peace of mind it provided. Marcus had moved to another state, according to mutual friends, and seemed to be staying out of trouble. Sarah wished him well from a distance and hoped he would find a way to deal with his problems without hurting anyone else. As Sarah unlocked the door to her bright, warm apartment, she smiled at the sight of her yellow walls and thriving plants. Tomorrow she had classes, work, and dinner with Jessica, Next week, she would start a new photography project documenting the stories of domestic violence survivors. Next month, she would take her first vacation in years, a solo trip to California to visit Elena. The future stretched ahead of her, full of uncertainty, but also full of promise. Sarah Martinez had learned that she was stronger than she had ever imagined, braver than she had ever hoped, and worthy of all the love and happiness that life had to offer. The woman who had once thought she was frozen had discovered that she was actually fire, burning bright and impossible to extinguish.